Unresolved emotions do not disappear with time or understanding. When an emotional experience is too intense, too sudden, or too unsupported to be fully felt, it remains incomplete in the nervous system. Rather than resolving, it reorganizes perception, behavior, and identity around its unfinished charge. Over time, this reorganization begins to look like personality. From a somatic perspective, personality is not simply a collection of traits or preferences. It is often the visible pattern that forms around unprocessed emotional states. Fear that could not move through the body becomes vigilance. Grief that could not be felt becomes emotional distance. Anger that could not be expressed becomes control, compliance, or chronic tension. These patterns are not chosen. They emerge as adaptive strategies designed to prevent the original overwhelm from returning. As unresolved emotions persist, the nervous system builds predictability around them. Thoughts, beliefs, habits, and relational styles crystallize to maintain a sense of safety. What begins as protection gradually hardens into identity. The system no longer remembers the original emotion. It only knows the posture required to keep it contained. In this way, personality becomes less an expression of essence and more a structure of avoidance. Importantly, this shaping is not pathological. It reflects the intelligence of the nervous system doing the best it can with what was available at the time. The false self described in this chapter is not false because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. It is a version of self organized around what could not yet be felt. Healing, then, does not require dismantling personality. It requires completing what was left unfinished, allowing unresolved emotions to move, settle, and integrate, so identity can soften back into presence. The small self is not a psychological flaw or a mistaken identity that needs to be eliminated. From a somatic perspective, it is a survival structure, an organization of attention, behavior, and self-reference that forms when the nervous system learns that openness is not safe. When early experiences of overwhelm, unpredictability, or emotional isolation exceed the body's capacity to integrate,
the system contracts around what it can manage. Identity narrows not because it is true, but because it is tolerable. This contraction creates a sense of self that is vigilant, self-monitoring, and effort-based. The small self remains oriented toward control, approval, and anticipation, constantly scanning for threat or instability. Its function is not to express aliveness or truth, but to maintain coherence under pressure. In this way, the small self is less a personal failure, and more a biologically intelligent adaptation. Over time, this survival organization becomes familiar and self-referential. Thoughts revolve around me, my safety, and my position. Because the nervous system has learned that stability depends on constant management. Even moments of expansion, joy, love, success, stillness can feel destabilizing, as they threaten to dissolve the tight structure that once ensured survival. The system may respond by pulling back, bracing, or reasserting control. Importantly, the small self does not dissolve through insight, transcendence, or self-improvement. Because it is held in the body, it softens only when the nervous system no longer needs its protection. As safety increases through lived experience, capacity expands. The contraction loosens on its own. What remains is not a larger self, but a more available one. Identity no longer organized around survival but around presence. The ego does not resist change because it prefers suffering or limitation. It resists because it is organized around familiarity. From a somatic perspective, the ego is not an abstract mental construct, but a pattern of nervous system regulation that has learned which contractions keep the system safe.
What is familiar is not what feels good, it is what feels predictable. When early experiences teach the body that openness leads to overwhelm, loss, or instability, contraction becomes the default state. The ego forms around this contraction, shaping identity, perception, and meaning in ways that preserve it. Relaxation, expansion, or unguarded presence are not interpreted as relief, but as risk. The nervous system reads unfamiliar openness as a threat to continuity, even when external conditions are safe. As change begins, through healing, insight, or improved circumstances, the ego mobilizes to restore the old baseline. This resistance often appears as doubt, self-criticism, distraction, or sudden urgency to do something. These reactions are not failures of will or understanding. They are protective reflexes designed to return the system to known territory. Importantly, the ego's defense of contraction is not conscious or strategic. It is automatic. The nervous system equates familiarity with survival, and the ego functions as the narrator that justifies this preference. It creates stories that explain why expansion is dangerous, premature, or irresponsible. reinforcing the sense that staying small is sensible. From the somatic path, freedom does not come from confronting or dismantling the ego. It comes from increasing the body's capacity to tolerate new states without collapse or overwhelm. As unfamiliar safety becomes lived and repeatable, contraction no longer feels necessary. The ego relaxes not because it is defeated, but because the nervous system no longer needs it to maintain coherence. Within a somatic understanding, the ego is not an adversary to be overcome, transcended, or dismantled. It is the imprint of protection shaped by the nervous system in response to lived experience.
Every ego structure originates not from deficiency, but from necessity. It forms at the precise point where the body learned that presence alone was not enough to ensure safety. What is often judged as egoic behavior? Control, defensiveness, self-importance, withdrawal, or vigilance are not moral failures or psychological flaws. They are protective strategies encoded during moments when the system could not remain open without risk. In those moments, contraction was not a choice. It was the only available intelligence. From this view, there is no pathology in the ego's existence. There is innocence. The ego did not arise to separate, dominate, or distort truth. It arose to preserve continuity in the face of overwhelm. It learned how to stabilize experience, contain sensation, and maintain coherence when the environment could not support full embodiment. As the ego matures, it continues to protect long after the original threat has passed. Not because it is stubborn or resistant to growth, but because it has no direct evidence that protection is no longer required. The nervous system does not update through insight or reinterpretation. It updates through lived experience of safety. Somatic healing, therefore, is not a battle with the ego. It is a reconciliation. As the body experiences safety without contraction, the ego naturally softens. It relinquishes control not because it is defeated, but because its job is complete. What remains is not egolessness, but innocence restored. Identity no longer shaped by survival, but by presence, responsiveness, and quiet coherence. The dissolution of an old identity is not a psychological event or a conceptual shift.
It is a physiological process that unfolds only when the nervous system has sufficient capacity to remain regulated. Without the structures that once ensured safety, identity does not release because it is seen through or understood. It releases when the body no longer needs it. From a somatic perspective, identity is a stabilizing pattern. It organizes perception, behavior, and self-reference in ways that protect the system from overwhelm. When these patterns begin to loosen, the experience can feel disorienting or unsettling. Familiar thoughts, motivations, and roles lose their grip, creating a sense of groundlessness. This liminal phase is often misinterpreted as regression, loss, or instability, when in fact it signals that deeper regulation is underway. Safe dissolution does not involve forcing change or dismantling identity through effort. When identity is challenged faster than the nervous system can tolerate, the system responds by reasserting old patterns, tightening, bracing, or creating new forms of control. The body must learn, through lived experience, that it can remain coherent without the familiar contraction. As capacity increases, moments of non-identification naturally arise. Awareness remains present even as the old reference points soften. There is less need to define, manage, or protect a sense of self. Importantly, what dissolves is not aliveness or agency, but the survival-based organization of identity. Letting the old identity dissolve safely means allowing this process to unfold at the pace of the body. With sufficient safety and integration, identity reorganizes around presence rather than protection.
What emerges is not emptiness or loss, but a quieter, more flexible sense of self, one that no longer needs to be held together through effort. The self you built was never a mistake. It was a necessary construction, an identity shaped by adaptation, protection, and survival. It organized life around what the nervous system could manage, creating coherence in environments where full openness was not yet possible. From a somatic perspective, this constructed self is not something to reject or outgrow through effort. It is something that naturally loosens when it is no longer required. As healing unfolds and capacity increases, the system begins to sense that it can remain regulated, without constant self-management. The effort once needed to hold identity together starts to soften. Roles, narratives, and habitual self-definitions lose urgency. This shift is often subtle and gradual. Rather than a dramatic transformation, it feels like a quiet easing, a reduction in the need to perform, explain, or protect who one is. When the built self makes room, what emerges is not a new identity to adopt, but a deeper availability.
Awareness no longer organizes itself around defense. Perception becomes less filtered through fear, anticipation, or control. The body experiences presence as inhabitable rather than threatening. In this state, identity is no longer something that must be maintained. It becomes something that moves fluidly with experience. Importantly, the self you are does not replace the self you built through force or insight. It becomes visible when the conditions that required construction dissolve. There is no rupture, only a reorganization. The nervous system shifts from managing survival to allowing contact, responsiveness, and rest. When this transition occurs, life feels less effortful. Not because challenges disappear, but because they are met without contraction. The self that remains is quieter, less defended, and more intimate with experience. Identity no longer standing between awareness and life, but resting within it.